The ultimatum came quietly, delivered without drama or tears in a dressing room after a performance in 1942. Lucille Wilson, a dancer at the Cotton Club, looked at Louis Armstrong with the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty and said 7 words that would change both of their lives. "It's the other women or me. Choose." Louis, 41 years old, 3 failed marriages behind him, a pattern of infidelity so ingrained it seemed like part of his identity, stood there holding his trumpet and realized something profound. He was tired of the chaos, tired of the lying, tired of treating relationships like they were disposable. And this woman who had every reason to walk away was offering him something he'd never had before. Not just love, but structure. Not just companionship, but accountability. Not rescue, but partnership. Louis chose Lucille, and for the next 29 years, until his death in 1971, he would remain faithful to that choice. But this isn't a simple story about a woman saving a man. It's more complicated than that, because what Lucille actually did was refuse to save Louis until he was willing to save himself. Louis Armstrong's first 3 marriages had followed a depressingly similar pattern. He'd meet someone in the music world, fall hard and fast, marry quickly, and then proceed to destroy the relationship through neglect and infidelity. His first wife, Daisy Parker, a prostitute from New Orleans, lasted only 4 years before the violence and chaos became unbearable for both of them. His second wife, Lil Hardin, was a talented pianist who had actually advanced Louis's career, but he'd repaid her guidance by cheating constantly and eventually abandoning the marriage entirely. His third wife, Alpha Smith, a dancer, had endured Louis's infidelities until she couldn't anymore, filing for divorce after just 4 years. By 1942, Louis had a reputation. Everyone in the music business knew he was brilliant and unreliable in equal measure. Brilliant on stage, unreliable in relationships. He'd love you intensely for 3 months, then forget you existed while he pursued the next attraction. It wasn't malicious. Louis genuinely cared about the women in his life, but he cared about his career more, and he cared about his freedom most of all. The idea of being accountable to another person, of limiting his options, of choosing one woman and sticking with that choice seemed impossible for him, not because he didn't want it, but because he didn't know how to do it. Lucille Wilson was different from Louis's previous wives in almost every way. She wasn't a musician, wasn't trying to advance her own career through him, wasn't impressed by his fame in the way that made her overlook his flaws. She was a professional dancer, successful in her own right, with a life and identity separate from Louis Armstrong. When they met at the Cotton Club in New York, Lucille saw Louis clearly, talented, charismatic, and emotionally unavailable. She had no illusions about who he was or what being with him would require, and that clarity became her power. Their courtship was brief. Louis pursued Lucille with the same intensity he'd brought to his previous relationships, showering her with attention, gifts, declarations of love. Lucille accepted the attention but maintained boundaries that his previous partners hadn't. She wouldn't rearrange her life to accommodate his schedule. She wouldn't quit her job to travel with him. She wouldn't pretend not to notice when he was clearly interested in other women. And that refusal to be controlled or diminished caught Louis off guard in the best possible way. Here was a woman who wanted him but didn't need him, who liked him but wouldn't tolerate his nonsense, who saw his potential for better behavior and refused to settle for less. They married in October 1942, Louis's fourth wedding, Lucille's second. Both brought baggage and scars from previous relationships. Both knew the statistics weren't in their favor, but Lucille had conditions and she made them explicit before the wedding. "I won't share you," she told Louis. "I won't compete with other women. I won't pretend not to know when you're lying to me. You can have me or you can have your pattern, but you can't have both." For the first time in his life, Louis was being asked to choose with full awareness of what that choice would cost him. Not freedom versus obligation, but chaos versus partnership. Not independence versus constraint, but emptiness versus connection. Louis chose connection, and then had to learn what that choice actually meant, because choosing to be faithful wasn't the same as being faithful. Choosing to be a good husband wasn't the same as being a good husband. Louis had to unlearn decades of habits, had to resist impulses that felt natural, had to build new patterns where old ones had been. And Lucille, rather than rescuing him from his struggles or making it easier by lowering her standards, held him accountable. When he flirted with other women, she called him out. When he made plans without consulting her, she reminded him they were partners. When he fell into old patterns of emotional unavailability, she didn't chase him. She gave him space to decide whether he wanted to do the work of being present. What made their relationship work wasn't that Lucille changed Louis. It was that Lucille refused to participate in the dynamics that had enabled Louis's worst behavior in previous relationships. She didn't rescue him from consequences. She didn't make excuses for him to others. She didn't sacrifice her own needs to accommodate his selfishness. Instead, she maintained her own life, her own friends, her own interests. She loved Louis completely but didn't make him the center of her universe. And that paradox, loving someone fully while maintaining your own identity, gave Louis something to aspire to rather than something to take for granted. Early years of their marriage tested both of them. Louis's touring schedule meant months apart. The temptations of the road, the availability of other women, the loneliness of hotel rooms, all of it pulled at Louis's old patterns. There were moments when he wavered, when the familiar pull of infidelity felt easier than the work of fidelity. But Lucille's response to these moments was crucial. She didn't beg or plead or threaten. She simply restated the boundary: you know what I need. You know what I won't tolerate. The choice is yours. That calm certainty, that refusal to engage in drama, made Louis responsible for his own choices in a way he'd never been before. And slowly, surprisingly, Louis changed. Not because Lucille demanded it, but because maintaining the relationship required it. The benefits of partnership, the stability of having someone who actually knew him, who cared about his well-being, who provided structure and support, those benefits became more valuable than the temporary excitement of new attractions. Louis discovered something he'd never known before, that fidelity wasn't a prison but a foundation, that choosing one person deeply was more satisfying than choosing many people shallowly. But Lucille's role wasn't just about setting boundaries. She also provided Louis with something he desperately needed: a home. Not just a physical space, though she created that too, but an emotional home. A place where he could rest without performing, where he didn't have to be Louis Armstrong the entertainer but could just be Pops the man. Lucille managed their household with efficiency and grace, creating routines and rhythms that gave Louis's chaotic life some stability. She handled finances, managed social obligations, protected his time and energy. She became the infrastructure that allowed his talent to flourish without the constant drama that had characterized his previous relationships. People who knew them described a partnership of equals despite their different roles. Louis was the star, the talent, the public face, but Lucille was the manager, the organizer, the protector. When racist hotel policies tried to deny them rooms, Lucille fought back. When promoters tried to cheat Louis, Lucille reviewed contracts. When Louis's health started failing in his later years, Lucille became his advocate with doctors, his nurse at home, his fierce defender against anyone who would push him beyond his limits. She had power in the relationship not through manipulation or control, but through competence and clarity. The question people always ask, the question that reveals more about cultural assumptions than about the relationship itself, was whether Lucille gave up too much. Whether being Mrs. Louis Armstrong meant losing Lucille Wilson. The answer was complicated. Yes, Lucille's dancing career ended after marriage. Yes, she became known primarily as Louis's wife. Yes, her identity became entangled with his in ways that made her invisible to many. But Lucille herself seemed to understand that identity isn't zero-sum, that you can be someone's partner without ceasing to be yourself, that supporting someone else's greatness can be its own form of greatness when it's chosen freely rather than imposed through expectation. What Lucille did that Louis's previous wives hadn't was maintain boundaries even within deep commitment. She wouldn't tour with Louis constantly, insisting on time at home. She maintained friendships separate from Louis's circle. She had interests and activities that didn't involve him. And that separateness, that insistence on remaining herself even while being his partner, kept the relationship healthy in ways that total merger would have prevented. Louis could return home from tour and find Lucille still fully present, still vibrant, still herself, not waiting in suspended animation for his return, but continuing to live her own life. The relationship wasn't perfect. Louis could be difficult, moody, self-absorbed in the way creative people often are. Lucille could be controlling, rigid about schedules and routines in ways that frustrated Louis's more spontaneous nature. They fought, they had periods of tension, but what distinguished their fights from the conflicts in Louis's previous marriages was that both were committed to resolution. Neither used conflict as an excuse to check out emotionally or seek comfort elsewhere. They fought and then they repaired, building a relationship that could withstand disagreement without collapsing. As Louis aged, as his health deteriorated, the nature of their partnership shifted. Lucille became less wife and more caretaker, managing Louis's declining body with the same competence she'd brought to managing their household. She monitored his medications, enforced rest when he wanted to keep working, advocated for him with doctors who didn't always take his symptoms seriously. Louis, who had spent most of his life being served by women without fully seeing them as people, began to understand what Lucille had been giving him all along, not just practical support but unconditional presence, not rescue. But partnership. In July 1971, Louis Armstrong died at home in Queens with Lucille by his side. He was 70 years old. They had been married for 29 years, longer than all his previous marriages combined. In those final moments, Louis looked at Lucille and said something she would never fully share with the public, some private acknowledgement of what she had meant to him, what their partnership had created. And then he was gone, and Lucille was left to grieve and remember and decide who she would be in the absence of the man who had defined so much of her adult life. What Lucille did next revealed everything about who she was and who she'd always been. She didn't retreat into widowhood as a permanent identity. She didn't spend the rest of her life being Louis Armstrong's widow and nothing else. Instead, she threw herself into preserving Louis's legacy while also reclaiming her own. She established the Louis Armstrong House Museum, ensuring that their home would become a public space for understanding Louis's life and work. She managed his estate with the same competence she'd brought to managing their household. She gave interviews, sharing stories about Louis but also asserting her own perspective, her own experiences, her own voice. Lucille lived for 28 more years after Louis died, passing away in 1983 at the age of 69. In those years, she created a life that honored her partnership with Louis while also existing independent of it. She maintained friendships, pursued interests, traveled, lived. She was Louis Armstrong's widow, yes, but she was also Lucille Armstrong, a woman with her own story, her own strength, her own legacy. And perhaps that's the most important part of this story, that the woman who saved Louis Armstrong did so not by sacrificing herself but by refusing to be sacrificed. That her power came from maintaining her own identity even while building a shared life. So did Lucille save Louis Armstrong? The answer depends on what you mean by save. She didn't rescue him from his patterns. She created conditions where he could choose to change those patterns himself. She didn't fix him. She refused to enable the behaviors that were breaking him. She didn't sacrifice her identity to build him up. She maintained her own foundation strong enough to support partnership without collapsing into it. That's not the dramatic salvation narrative we usually tell about relationships. It's better than that. It's partnership. It's two people choosing each other daily and doing the work that choice requires. The 7 words Lucille spoke in 1942, "It's the other women or me, choose," weren't a rescue. They were an invitation to Louis to rescue himself, to decide what he wanted his life to be, to take responsibility for his own happiness instead of always looking for the next excitement, the next escape, the next woman who might finally make him feel complete. Louis accepted that invitation, made the choice, did the work. And for 29 years, he and Lucille built something that none of his previous relationships had been: sustainable, real, adult. The woman who saved Louis Armstrong did so by refusing to save him until he was ready to save himself, by maintaining standards he had to rise to meet, by being a partner instead of a parent, a collaborator instead of a caretaker, a wife instead of a fan. Lucille Wilson saw Louis Armstrong clearly, loved him completely, and insisted that he become the man capable of receiving that love, not through manipulation or ultimatums that controlled him, but through boundaries that protected both of them. Through maintaining her own identity strong enough that loving Louis didn't require losing herself. That's the real story, not simple, not neat, not the fairy tale where love conquers all or the rescue narrative where a good woman fixes a broken man. Better than those stories. Truer, the story of two imperfect people choosing partnership over chaos, growth over comfort, the hard work of actual love over the easy excitement of constant newness. Louis Armstrong and Lucille Wilson, for 29 years, until death did them part. And even after death, Lucille's strength continued, her legacy separate from but connected to Louis', her story worth telling not just because of who she was to him, but because of who she was, period. The woman who saved Louis Armstrong, by refusing to sacrifice herself to do it. by insisting that salvation was something he had to choose for himself, by being present and strong and clear and unshakable. That's Lucille, that's partnership. That's what it actually looks like when love works not despite difficulty but through it, not magical, not easy, just real. And real, it turns out, was exactly what both of them needed.